Okay, so this is part three. We're into the interesting time period for Pink Floyd. Not that the other time periods or their career wasn't also interesting, but interesting in that I feel in this period they really kind of lost their way and then actually rediscovered a whole new form, musical form, very different from the first albums that they then worked on. And then right at the tail end of this period, they moved into another musical form that then went on to be Dark Side of the Moon. So incredibly a sense of changing their musical structure, their musical format right the way through, almost inventing different genres within the main genre of pop or rock. They certainly started out as a pop band and then very much became a sort of classic 70s rock band by the time of Dark Side of the Moon. So the songs got shorter and so on and so forth. But first of all, let's start off with the Big Cow album. So that really is the quintessence of cow. Like, I don't think there's a more perfect representation of the cow than on that album. And you'll notice there's no song titles or title of the band or anything on there. So that was pretty unique. Although other bands, I think, had certainly done that before. But anyway, I'm sure the record company weren't pleased. The photographer who took the picture of the cow said he couldn't imagine taking a more perfect representation of a cow. It had a certain element of cowness. If we think about Plato, the philosopher, and his theory of forms, he very much talked about, there's the idea that all the forms on earth are corrupted in some way and they're a mere representation of the metaphysical realm of perfect forms. So following Plato, there would be sort of substandard cows on earth, even if we both drawed a picture of a cow, it would be not a perfect representation of the cow. There'd only be the perfect representation of the cow in the realm of forms. So obviously you can move that across to ideas of truth and justice, which is what Socrates through Plato did, and the idea that, there's only a perfect form of truth outside of the realm, outside of the earthly realm. Down here, there's always going to be corrupted forms of truth and justice and the good and love. Incredibly influential idea that still carries on today. But if you're thinking of, okay, so there's this realm of perfect ideas, this realm of perfect truth and so on and so forth, the realm of the perfect cow must exist up there as well. And what we see down here is only a corrupted version of a cow. Maybe not as philosophically edifying as the idea of truth, the perfect truth, and then a corrupted form of truth. Now, that's certainly carried on, as I said, very influential. If you think of the American Declaration of Rights, just trying to think off the top of my head, the first sentence anyway, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So this is certainly an ideal that a lot of people, including Martin Luther King, famously in one of his speeches said, America doesn't live up to that ideal, but at least they have it on paper. At least it's on paper. Whereas some of the other countries Martin Luther King mentions, like China, never committed themselves to these perfect ideals. So in some ways, Martin Luther King saying, at least America has committed itself to these ideals. And there's a good argument that the reason America gets so much criticism, especially from outside of the United States, is because of the fact that it does actually put itself up as an ideal, as a perfect form, if you will, in Plato's reckoning. So there's a perfect ideal of America that always falls short, but at least it's up there as a perfect form, perfect ideal, perfect cow. Bit of a meandering, off-track sort of rant there, but anyway, we need to get down to this. So we've got a perfect cow on the cover. Is this a perfect album? I'd agree, probably not. I think this is their most difficult album. I have tried and tried to like it. So let's go straight in. So we've got the Atom Heart Mother's Suite is the first piece of music in A, B, C, D, E, F, which seems very arbitrary. Roger Waters has said of the Atom Heart Mother's Suite that it needs to go in the garbage bin, which wasn't very nice to the guy who also conducted the orchestra and the horns and everything, Ron Geeson, who also, as I mentioned before, did a solo album with Roger Waters. So, and David Gilmour subsequently, in the 2000s, I think, played the Atom Heart Mother Suite with Ron Geeson somewhere live. So he's obviously got a bit more. He's more amenable to giving it maybe a better grade than Roger Waters. So is it really that terrible? Now, the other thing you should know about this suite is that Stanley Kubrick wanted to use it for Clockwork Orange, and they knocked him back. So if when the Droogs are going along, walking along, or when they're burning along the alleyway, the English alleyway in a car, you can think of ba 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 as being the theme, and that really working well. And also it would have given, not that Pink Floyd needed a big audience, but it would give them an even bigger audience. But Roger Waters has said he's actually happy that didn't happen because it might have tarnished a suite of music that Waters hated to begin with. I don't know. And I think, yeah, it probably would have worked well in some of those scenes in Clockwork Orange. But it would have been a whole different beast then. So now it's very much, to me, encapsulates a certain time period in the very early 1970s in England. Progressive rock is just sort of breaking out. And this went to #1. That's another surprising fact. They had an inordinate time period where they could develop their craft and still get top-selling records. So they weren't pressured by record companies. If you got a #1 album and you're sort of flailing away in the dark, you can take your time to produce something that you think is more representative of your own, soul musical style. So they were very lucky in that way. So Alan Parsons, again, was an engineer with Peter Bown, and Norman Smith, still executive producer from the early albums, and recorded at Abbey Road. So another thing about the suite is that it seems to really drag. Now, I know you could blame Nick Mason for this, and I think he has said that he was struggling to play with, or they overdubbed all the horns and orchestras after they did the rhythm track. Could have been vice versa, but anyway, they don't cohere, they don't connect very well. So it sounds as if Mason's constantly slowing down, which he did do, which is a classic Floyd sound, but it does tend to drag it. There are some great live versions of this on the early years box set that are worth checking out, that seem to me to have a bit more life to them, be a bit more vibrant. So the recorded version still has its charms. The use of the choir, the organ, I think, is very good. Rick Wright's playing on this is very good. And the main theme is not terrible. I think they did it better on Echoes a bit later. But it's still, I find, when I was working on my thesis, that I never have background music, but I found I could have this on the background. It wouldn't blow my mind so much. But there is, there's some quite avant-garde sections to it where I guess again, Kubrick might have been drawn to them. Kubrick picked the great soundtrack for Clockwork Orange, so using Beethoven and all that other wonderful Walter Carlos music, the Moog synthesizer. So anyway, Atom Heart Mother, yes, that's the whole first side of the first album. So to me, that's problematic, but it's not terrible. Not terrible. Went to #1, remember? Doesn't tell us anything. Now, so this, again, I'm saying is their most difficult album. So side 2 opens up with a song that I really do like, but it sounds like it was recorded in a cardboard box. not a cardboard box, a shoebox. So I would go even smaller than a cardboard box down to a shoebox. Tiny little box. And Waters is almost whispering. It's a pretty good song. It's probably the most psychologically profound song that Roger Waters had written up to this time, called If. If I was a good man, I'd understand the distance between friends. It meanders along. It's a terrible, muddy recording to put as the first track of the second side. I think they should have put the Rick Wright song, which is much more vibrant and has a much more top end. This is very dull, and one of the reviews of the time said this is the worst kind of folk music, English folk. Terrible sort of representation of English folk music of the time. But yeah, I think it could have been on the album more as an instrumental finger-picking song that would have fitted in there well. It was recorded a bit better. So Waters, yes. Summer 68 by Rick Wright. Again, I think this is not a terrible song. Pretty good. Similar to Sisyphus of Ummagumma. I think that's the one that has How Do You Feel? How Do You Feel? Yeah, ba, 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 ba. So that could be the beginning of the side. Give it a good bit of punch. So not probably Rick Wright's best song, maybe up to that time. Although I do have a love of some of those ones off A Source Full of Secrets. And, Paintbox. Fat Old Son. Now, this could probably be one of the best songs on the album by Gilmour. Definitely his best song that he'd written up to that time. Obviously ripping off Ray Davies a bit with Lazy Old Son off the album Something Else. But it is also very distinct and different in enough ways, so it's not too much of a pastiche of that song or a copy of that song or a representation of that song. So and he's got a great thin mellow voice that Gilmour was really good at doing, that he kind of lost later on, but and then regained it again in the 2000s. I think he was doing a lot of coke in the 90s and the 80s when they got back together then, so he shouted a lot. But Fat Old Son, probably the highlight of the album, and there's a great outro on it where Gilmour really cracks into the guitar and just kicks in, and they play that a lot live too at the time, and he also did it on a recent concert, a great version of it on a recent concert, and really cranks up the guitar for the solo at the end of it. So look, second side with Rick Wright's song. They're all three good songs, and then we've got Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast. Well, it's not terrible. It's not great. It's background music, I think you could call. Sometimes some people call very rudimentary art that doesn't hold any passion or zest, they call it motel art. I would call Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast motel prog music, like prog music by numbers, and it's a bit beneath Pink Floyd, although you do get to hear an egg being cracked and crackling. There's nothing particularly psychedelic about it, but yeah, there you go. So all in all, you've got the suite, which you can take or leave that. Then you've got If, which is a great song that needs to be re-recorded. Summer of 68, which is fine. Fat Old Son, which is great. And then Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast. So yeah, I'd probably say this is their weakest album, but a great cover. And hey, it came after Ummagumma, which is one of my favourites. So, and they soon got back on track, which I will look at. So on the CD version, you get a few more cows on the back there. And I like on the CD versions, they've actually got pictures of the band where they don't look like, they look like they've got a sense of humour anyway. They don't look so sullen, so serious, so fusty. So now we are going to go to what a lot of people think is a classic, Meddle. That's a pig's ear, if you're wondering. So a close-up of a pig's ear. I think reading Nick Mason's book, they really, that wasn't they really didn't give the go-ahead of that. It was quite rushed, and then they thought, and they certainly picked a woefully bad picture for the double spread, and hence they never had their photos on an album again. Perhaps Momentary Lapse of Reason was the exception, but check this out. And they're not unattractive men, but this is the end of the 60s. All that beautiful Carnaby Street clothing just gone. Carnaby Street fashion gone. And they pretty much wore clothes that you might find in a miniskirt. A friend of mine, I think, said they look like they've rolled out of a miniskirt. Well, maybe I thought that. Anyway, let's not just talk about the package. Let's look inside, though. So this album, again on the CD version, there's a more happy photo, perhaps, showing their great sense of humour. Well known for that, especially Roger Waters. Anyway, so the first track, One of These Days, is, I've heard people who are complete hate Pink Floyd because John Lydon wore that T-shirt that said, "I hate Pink Floyd." And the arch followers of the punk aesthetic, can't like Pink Floyd. One guy on Facebook or some social media said, "I was listening to One of These Days and it sounded pretty good." Then all his friends come in and go, "Oh no, it couldn't have sounded good. You must be wrong." Rubbish. It's a great song. Not so much a song as a musical piece. But again, live at Pompeii, there's a nighttime version or a twilight version or just after the Golden Hour, the Terrence Malick Golden Hour, where Mason stumbles around the drums for about 8 minutes and they film him from all different angles. And some people, less kind people, might say, "Gee, he's a pretty ordinary drummer." But he does the great bit in the middle where he says, "One of these days I'm going to cut you into little pieces," which I'm sure was written by Roger Waters, right up his alley. And yeah, it's a very evocative, a great soundtracky type, Doctor Who type sound, using the synthesizer and the Echoplex bass guitar, the bass guitar going through an Echoplex system. And it's a great opening track. Then you've got Pillow of Winds and Fearless, which are both very mellow, well recorded, very representative of the early 70s, the end of the 60s. They really encapsulate that change from the experimentation, the roughness, the wildness, the rough edges, the innovation of the late 60s, and then the kind of more formulaic, well-recorded, safer sound of the 70s. So you can hear on their albums exactly where this happened. So Armagumma would be pushing the end of the 60s, that whole aesthetic of innovation and taking risks and avant-garde even, to this more safer sound. Atom Heart Mother might have been the last gasp of that. So, and then you've got this much more FM radio friendly album, which I certainly don't think they deliberately did, but it's just they were living in their times, and so culturally they were forced to do this, as you might say. So Pillow of Winds and Fearless, yeah, they're both, Gilmour I think sings on both of them, and they're both beautiful recorded sort of acoustic type tracks, which are great on a summer's day if you're having a picnic. And then we've got Saint-Tropez and Seamus, which I think are two of the worst tracks that they recorded ever. Fortunately, Seamus is very short, but it's basically them playing a rudimentary blues pattern and then putting a microphone in front of a dog who howls. So, yes, obviously filler. On Pompeii, it's quite fun to watch them reenact it with a dog. So actually watching a dog howl along to the blues is interesting. But on the album, especially on an album like this, it doesn't work. Saint-Tropez is another close cousin of Biding My Time. Roger Waters writing a sort of middle-of-the-road jazz song, a jazz lounge type piece. I mean, it's not horrible to listen to, but it's really not their thing. So, yeah, on some, I once watched The X Factor, and yeah, someone got up and sang, and he was pretty bad, and then the big guy, the big black guy with the glasses, was like, man, singing's not your thing. Just, it's not your thing. So reminds me of that. Roger Waters, you've got a lot of talents, but leave middle of the road jazz, lounge jazz stuff alone. So actually, if you look at it, you've got, well, the first three songs are pretty good. Then San Tropez and Seamus, kind of ruin the end of the first side of the album. So this to me is not a classic because of this. But then you've got Echoes on side two, and yeah, easily one of their greatest tracks. Again, I think the live versions are quite a bit better than the studio ones. Although on the studio one, you still get that incredible seagull whale noise sound that Gilmour conjures up from his guitar, which is incredible. And the movements are all there. I think the recorded version, like the rest, like Atom Heart Mother, it's a bit muddy. Not shoebox muddy, but maybe cardboard box muddy. It's a bit muddy. There's not a lot of air in it, and it needs a lot more. What am I looking for? Not top end, because they've remastered this and they've really added a lot of treble, which I'll talk about with the Pompeii Remastered, as if remastering just means whacking up the treble, and you know, very problematic, especially with the Pompeii. I might as well mention that now. Yeah, the Pompeii albums come out on the early years box set, and the cymbals are just so loud, and the treble's been turned up so much, the top end's been turned up so much, it's almost unlistenable. A lot of people complained about it. I think the main problem is the cymbals that they recorded and the microphones they used at the actual Pompeii performance are to blame, and it sort of was cloaked. You didn't really notice it so much when you listened to it, the original version of it on the DVD, but now they've amped it up in the remastering. It's only accentuated that flaw that was already there. So Echoes, yes, a brilliant song. Some of the lyrics you might say are a bit la-di-da, very representative of the time, of the early 70s. But what is it? Yeah, let's see. Got them. Overhead, the albatross hangs motionless upon the air, and deep beneath the rolling waves in labyrinths of coral caves, the echo of a distant tide comes willowing across the sand, and everything is green and summerine. Yes, Roger Waters went on to a lot better lyric writing than that, but it all kind of works in the form of the song, in that the song is very much represents those lyrics or encapsulates that kind of lyrical sensibility. Very floaty, very trippy, certainly the opening section of it. But then it gets into the funky bit in the middle, and a friend of mine recently said that he took up playing bass guitar, listening to Waters play the Sunburst bass at Pompeii, which has such a great bottom end to it. I mean, all the sounds that they conjure up at Pompeii on those massive WEA amplifiers just give this such a power. And Rick Wright's organ playing is fantastic in this, and piano. Obviously the opening, the famous opening through an echo pedal or echo box or whatever it is, where he's just tapping one note of the piano. And there's been nothing, parts 1 to 8 are on the box set where you can hear an early version of this. So they obviously built up each section separately and then connected them all together. But it's really a flawless recording, the way that they did, like great architecture students that they are. It's all about form more than inspiration. Well, there's inspiration in there. I guess it's definitely not coming. It's not intuitive. It's very structured piece of music. But it's still, that doesn't lessen its enchantment. It's not a disenchanted piece of music because of the structure. So yeah, I obviously Echoes is one of their best tracks of all time, and it takes up the whole second side of the album. So yeah, I would say this is a great album because it's got Echoes on it, and it's got One of These Days on it. And the two, Pillow Winds and Fearless, are nice enough. And then the other two we could get rid of. But yeah, certainly a step up from Atom Heart Mother and a move in the right direction, as most critics have pointed out. Remaster on this Discovery box is really good too. You can really hear the acoustic guitars a lot clearer than you can on the original mix. And again, Echo sounds a little bit better. So lastly, I would like to go on to Obscured by Clouds, or the soundtrack to The Valley, La Valley. Again, this is the same director, Barbara Schroeder, who did the More film. On the early years box set, you can watch both those films, but only one of them I think has English subtitles. So I watched More, and that was quite enjoyable. But I started watching The Valley. It seemed like a lesser film. I think it's based on a spiritual quest in New Guinea. So Moore was pushing the hippie aesthetic enough, and another kind of spiritual quest in a primitive tribal culture, rich white people going in and getting back to their roots or finding themselves, is not something I want to sit through now. But again, I really like this album. So this album is often overlooked. They recorded it in 2 weeks, just before or during the time they were recording Dark Side of the Moon. And to me, yeah, it really is that link between their early progressive sound, where they were really pushing barriers and learning their craft in the studio, to this much more clean and radio-friendly sound. The songs are shorter, even though this is a soundtrack album. And yeah, Gilmour's vocals on this are just really, really well recorded and very, very clear, which became one of their trademark sounds. And also, yeah, Richard Wright sings on one of these tracks, and a similar thing. So you can really hear Dark Side of the Moon sort of peeping around the curtain in this album. So the first track, Obscured by Clouds, is great. That building sort of drum sound and the synthesizer. They've got the instrumentals, but a couple of instrumentals, but this is nothing like More, or even Zabriskie Point, where they're just putting in incidental music, but especially More. This is much more a collection of songs that seem to have been just tapped on into the movie. There's a couple of instrumentals, but it's mainly on this album, it's all songs. So Childhood's End is a great song, Gilmour singing that one. I think he wrote it too. And you've got, so it's a very collaborative album. The gold it's in is Waters and Gilmour, and that's probably their most radio-friendly, middle-of-the-road type rock sound that they had on any record, although it's definitely a precursor to Money, pretty much, or Time, that kind of really classic rock sound, with Gilmour doing much shorter solos but keeping that lovely sound that he had that he lost later on. So Burning Bridges is great, and then you've got these terrible titles on this album too. What's Up the Deal, which is a very mellow song with a beautiful acoustic guitar that they've recently made a clip for on the early years box set. It's up on YouTube. It's one of their great early songs. It's very middle of the road, very radio friendly. All the innovation and innovation and pushing the boundaries is stopped here, surprisingly enough. And it's just them rocking out and recording a whole lot of great tracks, just simple pop songs, not pop songs, classic rock songs. So again, they're moving away from, certainly not a return back to their early pop songs, but they certainly hadn't done these sort of 3-minute songs, a whole album of them. Well, they had Ummagumma, Adam Hart Mother, Meddle, so not for some time. So they're progressing in another whole genre. But it's definitely, as I said, a precursor to Dark Side of the Moon. It doesn't have the backing singers and some of the finesse that Dark Side of the Moon had, or the coherent lyrical theme. So, but it's definitely one that's overlooked a lot. And it's a great look. The person who did the soundtrack got a hell of a great soundtrack album, considering the film's pretty ordinary, but I think most people have forgotten about this now anyway. So, yeah, I would put this up as being one of their better albums in the whole oeuvre, or the canon of Pink Floyd, and just very different from any of their other albums, which is what's so great about Pink Floyd. They've almost invented some musical genres, or definitely developed other musical genres, and when they ever try and put together an entire greatest hits, it's all over the shop, because they just went so many different directions. And most of them were successful, whereas most bands try and plough another field and it ends up being a catastrophe. But no, they went for bucolic, rustic folk sort of tunes in More, and the second half of Adam Hart Mother did that pretty well. Did classic rock, they did prog rock, early space rock, great pop songs, 60s pop songs. And then really sort of classic FM radio, well recorded pop songs. And we've got, one I should mention is Free Fall, the Roger Waters song that some people always say is another precursor to his lyrical themes later on. But that was actually a single, I think. And the last tracks are sort of really nice instrumental with the primitive, not primitive, but New Guinea voices at the end of it, using a Freudian term there, so I forget that. So yeah, this has definitely been neglected from there. I don't think this was on the Shine On box set that came out in the 80s, so they certainly didn't think much of it then, but now it's been added back in, same as More, and it's certainly better than some of their later albums. So lastly, talking about compilations, there's this one, Pink Floyd Works, that came out, it came out quite a bit later in 1983, but it pretty much is a bookend to this period of Pink Floyd before they went on to Dark Side of the Moon, although it does have a couple of Dark Side of the Moon tracks on, but I'm going to look at it now. So it's got 3/4 on it, Embryo, which I talked about before, which was from the Amagama sessions. Several Species is on here, See Emily Play, Set the Controls, Eclipse, Brain Damage, Fearless off Meddle, Arnold Land, and One of These Days. So yeah, it's a great collection of songs. Unlike a collection of dance songs that comes later, I don't think none of these were re-recordings or anything that you really need to have. Someone will probably correct me about this, but I don't think any of these are different from the standard tracks. So yeah, it's nothing that you need to have, but it was obviously a strange greatest hits. I had quite a few of these, and worth having if you want everything. So this period, just summing up. Oh, I do have a nice bootleg called Eclipse, I think. So this has this is, I think, the BBC recordings that came out. Now have all come out, but it's Echoes, Adam Hart Mother, Embryo, Green is the Colour. Great version of Green is the Colour from around this time period with Gilmour singing, and the organ's really prominent. That's worth getting, but this is all in the early years box set that you can pick up now. So I would say Adam Hart Mother was a bit of a stumble, but down a dead end. Not 90 miles an hour down a dead-end street, but stumble nevertheless. And then Meddle really brought them back to the thing that they did best, which was this extended type of song, which they perfected, I think, with Shine On You Crazy Diamond later on. But and then Obscured by Clouds, which is also a very, very good album. And recorded, Nick Mason has lamented that they recorded that in 2 weeks, and people don't think of it as being that much worse than Dark Side of the Moon. It took them over a year to record. So just shows you sometimes when you're under the pump, just go for it and you'll end up with something half decent. Okay, obviously the next bit, I'd like to look at the 2 Barrett albums, which I think I put in because they were produced by Pink Floyd, and Rick Wright, Waters and Gilmour played on them. To me, they sort of fit into the Pink Floyd oeuvre. But and obviously after that, Dark Side Animals, Wish You Were Here, and The Wall, which probably needs a whole segment to itself. But yes, I hope you give some of these albums another go if you haven't got them. A lot of people when I worked in a record shop loved Obscured by Clouds simply because he hasn't been played to death like Dark Side of the Moon. But yeah, certainly Echoes is fantastic, and some of Adam Hart Mother, depending which mood you're in, is quite beguiling. Okay, I will see you at the Dark Side of the Moon.